There are so many things that can cause us to feel traumatized or have symptoms of trauma in adulthood that aren't necessarily these gigantic big things like wars or being assaulted or having abusive parents. It could come from so many other things that seem normal to us in our day-to-day lives, and I will talk about that in more depth in future videos. But today I want to just talk about some of the signs that could point to you possibly having unresolved childhood trauma and why those signs show up this way today. Sign number one that you have unresolved trauma is you are a people pleaser. People pleasing is our fourth trauma response. It's called the Fawn trauma response, and it shows up when we feel unsafe to express our needs in childhood or when we had to walk on eggshells when we were younger in order to not cause any more chaos in the home. Maybe you had parents that were really irritable and agitated, and maybe you had to make sure that you maintained the peace so that you wouldn't be yelled at, or so that dad wouldn't get mad or mom wouldn't get mad and start a fight, which causes you to feel even more stressed. So what happens is in the long term, you start to believe that the only way that people will accept you and love you and not be mad at you is if you are kind, gentle, always doing things for other people, putting your needs aside, because your needs in the past have resulted in people being annoyed or upset. Sign number two, you have a negative self-image or low self-esteem. So we develop our self-esteem in childhood when our parents encourage us and teach us and help us develop into who we truly are. They help us understand the ways of the world, what we like. They help us explore. And through that, we learn to develop a positive self-image. If we are valued and cared for by our family members or caregivers, then we in turn learn to value and love ourselves. But when we don't receive that in childhood, we begin to wonder what is wrong with us. We don't get the opportunity to learn about the things that we like and we enjoy, and we don't get the encouragement that we need to develop a positive outlook on life and on ourselves. So what ends up happening is we are constantly struggling with our identity. Who are we? What do we even like? Am I even lovable? Am I even likable? Am I even good enough? And this can happen even if you had great parents, but maybe you moved around a lot from place to place and you never really developed solidified relationships with your peers. So you never really had that intense, trusting relationship with someone else. You didn't get to learn about yourself through the eyes of others in positive ways. So you're constantly questioning who you are and you're constantly having to rebuild relationships. And so it becomes really difficult for you to have this solid ability to see who you are and have a high self-esteem. Also, if you struggled with an undiagnosed disorder in childhood, like ADHD or autism or anxiety or depression, and you went through school really struggling, that could have impacted you. And you thought something was wrong with you for that. So your self-esteem was lowered. You never really got the support or the help that you needed. And as you moved through life, you ended up feeling like you were not as good as everyone else. So you struggle with your self-esteem, you struggle with your self-image, and you're not really aware of your worth. Sign number three is you're constantly entering toxic, unhealthy, or relationships with emotionally unavailable partners. We learn how to be loved through our caregivers in childhood. If we received consistent, loving attention from our parents, encouragement from our parents, if they showed up for us when we needed them, if they spoke to us in the nice, gentle, kind way, then we learn to not expect any less. But if our parents were inconsistent, if they were abusive, if they were loud, if they were withdrawn, then we learn that's what love looks like. We don't understand what healthy love looks like, and it actually might make us uncomfortable when we meet somebody that can give us what a secure love might look like. We might not trust them. We might feel like they're lying or they're not being genuine, and our brain really prefers familiarity. If we are familiar in unhealthy dynamics, we not only seek out those relationships because we don't know how to handle healthy ones, but we seem to fall into them a lot more intensely and constantly than people who had secure relationships with their parents. Sign number 4. You struggle with emotional flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks are different than visual flashbacks in the sense that you don't automatically get transported into this time period when something bad was happening where you think you're there right now. An emotional flashback, simply put, is a trigger. When somebody around you is loud, you might find yourself really overwhelmed, stressed, and possibly going into a dissociative episode. You might feel really triggered emotionally when somebody says a specific word that just doesn't sit well with you. You might find yourself crying at certain things and you're not really sure why those things make you cry. All of these experiences might take us back to an emotional state that we felt when we were children. That's what an emotional flashback is. So when we experience childhood trauma, we might find that we have these triggers about certain things and certain situations around certain scents or sounds, and we're not quite sure why they're happening. And sign number 5 is you have deep-rooted shame. You feel that there's something inherently wrong with you. This goes back again to our caregivers, because when there's a lot of chaos happening in the home, children will almost always assume that it is their fault. If your parents or your caregivers didn't sit down with you and tell you that whatever chaos was happening around had nothing to do with you, if they didn't encourage you and love you and give you support in the way that you needed in an age-appropriate way, you would probably internalize all of those situations and think that somehow you are at fault for not being loved, for not receiving the time and attention from your parents, for not being able to calm your parents down when they were struggling. When you have the people pleasing that we talked about, the low self-esteem, and all of these other symptoms that come from childhood trauma, you begin to feel like, hey, if I was different, if I was a better child, if I didn't have this need, if I didn't want my parents to pay attention to me, if I could just take care of myself, then I would be okay, then my parents would love me. And then you develop, as a result of that, deep-rooted shame, thinking that something is inherently wrong with you because you weren't able to accept the lack of love and attention and attunement that your parents were not able to give you. If any of these sound common or familiar to you, I have some tips that might help you. Tip number 1. Work on building your self-esteem. And the way that we can do this is to do things that are esteemable, things that increase our self-esteem. You can start by finding your strengths. So sit down and think of the things that you love to do, you're good at, or other people have told you you're good at. Make a list of those things and then do more of those things. When we do things that take little effort but we're good at, or things that we enjoy doing, it naturally increases our love for ourselves, our love for the activities we're doing. It makes us feel good and competent, and in turn, in the long run, it will also increase our self-esteem. Tip number 2. If you're experiencing emotional flashbacks or a lot of people pleasing, then I want you to learn how to regulate your nervous system. I have a few videos on my channel that can help you do that. One of the books that I highly recommend if you don't have access to therapy is called Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection by Deb Dana. This book is filled with amazing resources, step-by-step guides on how to work with your body when it's dysregulated. If you have access to therapy, definitely seek out a therapist that is well versed in working with the nervous system and working on helping you regulate your emotions. But if you don't have access to therapy, this is a great book to start with. Another good book that you can look at is the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Skills Workbook. I'm not a dialectical behavioral therapist, but I really do love the exercises that are in this book. There's so many mindfulness exercises, self-care tips, things that you can do every single day to help regulate yourself and your nervous system. Number 3, work on healing your inner child. When you experience childhood trauma, and if you're experiencing any of the symptoms that I have mentioned, it's very likely that you're dealing with a wounded inner child or wounded inner children. So it's really important that you go back and you grieve all of that you missed out on, all the things that you didn't receive as a child that you needed, or maybe all the things that happened that hurt you. And one of the best ways that you can do this is through IFS therapy, if you have access to it, or any therapy that really works on those inner children. IFS stands for Internal Family Systems, and it basically talks about how we all have all of these parts of us that are developed through different parts of our lives when we experience a traumatic event, and we kind of get stuck there. So as we get older, yes, our body gets older, but we still have all of these wounded inner children inside of us. And those are the parts that take over when we're triggered or struggling, and we automatically start feeling like we're 5 or 6 or whenever that event happened. So if you don't have access to an IFS therapist or therapy in general, one of my favorite books to recommend for this is called Self-Therapy, and it actually comes with a workbook as well. So this is Self-Therapy, and it talks a lot about like the different types of parts that we all hold, what their purpose is, because each part of us serves a purpose in keeping us alive and healthy and functioning in the world. So you'll learn all about your parts here, and then if you want to take it a step further and really implement it on yourself, there's the Self-Therapy workbook, which is amazing as well. There's all of these exercises to help you really connect with your inner child and inner parts and inner world, and then help guide you through it so that you can heal those parts of you. And finally, work on setting boundaries. So setting boundaries is one of the biggest struggles that people experience when they're healing, because if you've never set a boundary in your life, if you've always struggled with people pleasing, then boundaries can feel aggressive. But I'm here to tell you that they are not aggressive. They are assertive, and they keep you and the relationships you're in protected. Let's start simple though. I know it's very difficult to all of a sudden start setting all of these boundaries, and you might find it overwhelming to do so. So one of my favorite tools to tell people when they're starting to set boundaries is to set boundaries with yourself. That means set time boundaries with how often you're on your phone, how often you clean, how much time you devote to yourself and self-care routine. If you're constantly working, then set a boundary for yourself when it's time to stop. It's easier to start with ourselves. Once you get really good at setting internal personal boundaries, start with setting positive boundaries with safe people. What are positive boundaries? Positive boundaries are really just choices. When you're a people pleaser and when you really struggle to give an opinion or show your true self, you might find yourself not even making decisions about small things like what restaurant we should go to, what we should do this weekend. Often people pleasers are like, oh, you choose, it's okay, I'm good with whatever. So I want you to actually make positive decisions that won't get people to dislike you or question you. So if you get an option, do you want Mexican or Italian this weekend? Make your choice. It's a lot easier to start there and then eventually work your way up to just telling people, no, I can't make it this weekend. No, I can't do that for you right now. No, I'm overwhelmed, but I will get back to you on that when I have more time. And as you can see, those are more advanced boundaries. But when we've been practicing boundaries with ourselves and positive boundaries, then we are then able to ease into the other forms of boundaries that might be a little more challenging. I hope that you found these tips useful, and if you found yourself agreeing with some of the symptoms that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, know that you're not alone. Let me know what other questions you have about what you heard in terms of the symptoms or in terms of the tips, and I'd be glad to clarify in the comments or possibly make a new video with more detail based on your questions. I'll see you in the next video.